Howdy. Today's COVID distance learning is about Nixon and Watergate. This is a tough lesson because it's complex. It's got a lot of people, a lot of moving parts. And in the end, it shakes Americans' belief in government. So I want to try to do it justice. If we were in the classroom, I'd be acting this out. I'd be having kids being Nixon and all the Mitchell and Ehrlichman and all these other conspirators. And I would actually kind of walk it out in class and show you. But due to the coronavirus, we can't do that. So what I'm going to try to do instead is by using a PowerPoint, try to help you explain the points behind Watergate scandal. All right, first off, you have to understand an important concept. It's called plausible deniability. And that's a way, if you're a leader, you can get things done that you would not want anyone to know that you knew were done. Like, for example, a leader says, take care of it. He tells his aides, take care of it. He really doesn't want to know how they take care of it, because if they do anything and they break the law, you know what? You're responsible. You're an accessory. You know it. So if your aides take care of stuff and you don't know how it's done, you could plausibly say, "Oh, I didn't know that. It's not my fault." So a lot of times politicians are going to put layers between themselves and the things that happen so that they can basically say, "I didn't know." We're going to talk about this next, or after break, when we talk about the Iran-Contra scandal and Ronald Reagan too. But the concept is really simple. And look at the quote over there from Nixon. The important thing is that we maintain plausible deniability. Simple terms, take care of the problem. Just don't tell me how you did it. Because if I don't know, I'm not guilty. I mean, I can reasonably say, I didn't know. And that's what you do as a leader. You put layers between yourself, and that way you can get things done that you would not normally do. All right. So the top of the pyramid is going to be Nixon. Richard Nixon was elected in 68. He's going to run for re-election in 72. It's really important to win in 72 because he lost in 1960 to John F. Kennedy, and that really grated on him. He really wanted to win in 72, but you have to remember, the Vietnam War is still not over in 72, and he's not out of it. And he promised in 68 that he would get us out of the war. And so he's kind of nervous. Surrounding him are H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman. If you look at Haldeman there at the painting, these are the two guys that are right next to Nixon. These are his right-hand men. You know, there's his go-to guys. Also important is going to be a guy named John Mitchell. You'll see a picture at the bottom of the page there with Nixon. John Mitchell was Nixon's friend. They played golf together. He's going to be the Attorney General of the United States, a person that Nixon trusts more probably than anyone else. And so to get reelected, he's going to make him head of the committee to reelect the president, which a lot of people call creep. All right, but there's a fly in the ointment. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers come out. And the Pentagon Papers were where the Pentagon took a look at the war in Vietnam. And, you know, they found a lot of mistakes. Remember, we talked in here, like the Gulf of Tonkin attack wasn't really an attack like we thought, you know, but we used that to go to war. Well, Nixon doesn't want this to come out at this time. He's running for re-election, and not all the mistakes that they find were his. More of them were LBJ's, but he doesn't want it to come out. He needs this to go away, and the Pentagon basically buries it. However, it gets leaked to the press, and it comes out. The Pentagon Papers become really important. Well, Nixon needs to get this problem to go away, you know? So, and with plausible deniability, you can do that. So he goes to Mitchell, basically. And again, I'm simplifying everything completely so your school kids can understand. So he goes to his friend Mitchell and says, hey, make this go away. Mitchell goes ahead and sets up this group called the Plumbers. And two of the most important plumbers are G. Gordon Liddy, who was an ex-FBI agent, and Howard Hunt, who had been in the CIA. Howard Hunt had actually been involved with the CIA in Florida and connected in a way, I guess, to like all the stuff the CIA did with Cuba. That down there is G. Gordon Liddy's book, Will. Wow. You read that book, that's a powerful book. G. Gordon Liddy, of all of the Watergate people, is the one that never apologizes because he hated communists, he hated lefts, and he loved Nixon, and he did what he thought was best for America. So he does it. His book, Will, is pretty interesting. Anyhow, so the plumbers are put to work. They break into a psychiatrist's office of one of the people involved in the Pentagon Papers, a guy named Daniel Ellsberg, to try to find records that will basically make him look bad. And eventually the Pentagon Papers are going to be quiet. You know, I mean, the scandal kind of quiets down. Well, the message goes back up the line from the Plumbers to Mitchell, problem taken care of. From Mitchell to Haldeman Ehrlichman, problem taken care of. From them to Nixon, problem taken care of. Well, so well that we're going to take the next step. The Democrats set up their headquarters in the Watergate complex in Washington. If you look at the picture there, there's offices and stuff like that. Well, the plumbers in 1972 election break into the Democratic offices. Why? They put taps on the phones. And that way you can listen to what the other guy's saying. They can look at the records. They can record who's donating money to the Democrats and get all the plans. And so that way they can actually spy on the Democrats. Well, they go in once, set stuff, it works. They come back, they go in a second time, and you don't want to go to the scene of crime too many times because they will be caught. Those you see the movie Forrest Gump, it's in the movie Forrest is calling the police because he sees all these lights in the building over there. But really, it wasn't that. It was a security guard. Notice that one of the doors had been taped. When they broke in, they put tape over the lock. Well, they would be caught. Basically, they kept their mouths shut, and it's just a burglary. And they're going to pay a fine and go. But there's something suspicious about someone breaking into the Democratic headquarters. Two characters that are also important are Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post. And these two reporters, with reporters' instinct, they know something's there, so they start writing stories about it. And then they write more stories about it. Well, they try to connect it to the White House, but they're having a hard time because they got all these different layers between the people that did it and the White House. Meanwhile, there's a high-level source in the administration that's mad about all the stuff that's happening in the crime, and this person meets them. If you watch the movie All the President's Kingsmen, there's going to be a scene where they meet this guy in a parking garage, and he's going to start telling them secrets. And basically, he helps them figure out and unravel the Watergate scandal, and they keep the pressure on. This informant, they kept his secret for years. Years later, they found out. We found out who he was. He was actually an FBI agent, a person who had known Mitchell. Attorney General's in charge of the FBI, and he knew what was going on, and he was disgusted by it. When he was older and developed cancer, he decided to reveal his name so he could tell his story. So we finally do now know who that was. But the story starts getting hot. If you look on the headline here, a grand jury indicts 7 of the Nixon aides. Look at all those people. And these are people that are connected. Howard Hunt rolls over. Howard Hunt says, I'm not going to jail for this, and he's going to roll over. And as these aides start rolling over and they start talking, it starts getting closer to Nixon. Now, Nixon gets involved at this time. He has meetings in the White House. What's going on? Now he knows. And once he knows, he no longer has plausible deniability. So now he's involved, and so he starts trying to cover it up. Nixon is not in trouble, really, for the break-in because he didn't order it directly. It's covering it up. Stopping justice, obstructing justice is where Nixon's going to get in trouble. And then all of a sudden it comes out that the White House has tape recordings. They tape everything for history. If you're a prosecutor, wouldn't you want those tape recordings? Well, Nixon says, I'm not going to give up the tape recordings. Executive privilege, you can't have the tape recording. And it goes to the Supreme Court. In the end, he's forced to give up the tapes. However, one of the most critical tapes where they're meeting and talking about all this stuff has a bunch of minutes that are erased. And if you read this stuff, his secretary supposedly erased it by accident. If you read everything she had to do, hold the button with her elbow, push a button with her finger, kick a lever with her foot, that's an accident. But when the tapes come out, they make Nixon look really, really bad. Now, if this isn't bad enough, while this is going on, Nixon's vice president, if you look at the picture there, Spiro Agnew is caught. He had been governor of Maryland, and he was caught doing some bad things with tax evasion and other money, and he resigns. So now Nixon just can't get a good break, can't get a good story. We know that in the Nixon administration, he did do other stuff. He does go to China. He does go to Russia, but Watergate becomes a story that just consumes his White House. Now, the conspirators, like you saw in the slide before, all these people, they all get indicted. Basically, most of them finally roll over. Or Nixon will fire them trying to say, hey, look, I fired him, and blah, blah, blah. But it keeps creeping closer to him. I would like to point out that of all the aides, and the ones that are testifying or convicted, they serve like slap on the hand wrist sentences and stuff. G. Gordon Liddy never did. And G. Gordon Liddy does do hard time in prison. So if you read his book, Will, you'll hear about that. But as the Watergate conspiracy, cover up, and all this stuff consumes America, I remember as a kid, that just was in the news. The hearings were on TV every day. It comes closer to Nixon. And Nixon's in trouble. When those tapes come out, Nixon is really in trouble because it shows him cussing and stuff. Here in Omaha, the Omaha World Herald, very Republican paper, supported Nixon. Carl Curtis and all of our people supported Nixon until the tapes come out and they find out that he cussed. He used the IRS to go after people. He did a bunch of stuff that wasn't presidential, and that turns their support. And when the tapes come out and the support turns against Nixon, the end is near. Gerald Ford is picked to become the vice president. Gerald Ford is from Omaha originally before he moved to Michigan. Gerald Ford was an honest man. Gerald Ford was a simple, straightforward guy. Gerald Ford had been on the Warren Commission of the JFK shooting and stuff, and he's picked to replace Spiro Agnew. Agnew's the picture right under word president there. But Gerald Ford becomes president. He picks a guy by the name of Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president. And it's the first time in history where both the president and the vice president were appointed. Neither one of them was elected. Well, Gerald Ford's vice president, Congress starts turning to impeachment. They are going to impeach Nixon. Nixon sees it coming. And in my own humble opinion, I think they would have impeached him. They would have convicted him. So rather than have that happen, Nixon resigns. 1974, Nixon officially resigns. Ford is sworn in as president, and then he does a couple things. He pardons, everybody points out Nixon, but Gerald Ford also pardoned a lot of draft dodgers. People who didn't want to go to Vietnam went to Canada, as long as they came back and did 2 years of community service for the 2 years that they didn't serve the government in the war. But then Ford pardons Nixon. Ford pardons Nixon really because he wants the national nightmare to end. All this he wants it done. Besides, can you have the President of the United States sitting in jail somewhere? That's just not doable. Ford pardons Nixon. But in the next election, a lot of people are going to hold that against Ford. If any of you guys ever watched the 70s show, there's a famous 70s show where Eric's dad, Red, is mad at Ford for pardoning Nixon. He keeps talking, Jerry, why'd you do that? Well, in the next election, a lot of people are going to hold that against Ford, and he won't get reelected. But there's a lot more involved in that election with inflation and everything else. So what can we learn? Well, in Watergate, the trust in our government is shaken like it has never been shaken before. You know, we now know from listening into like tapes of the White House, we understand a lot of things about Lyndon Johnson were not exactly, well, they were different if you look at the transcripts of a lot of Lyndon Johnson stuff. But Watergate opens up to the American public in the nightly news what happens in the White House and how presidents do stuff, and it's not all good. And really, after Watergate, I don't know that Americans, or most Americans, really trust their government the same way. Now, Nixon was not impeached, would have been, but since Watergate, we have impeached 2 presidents, one Democrat, one Republican. Bill Clinton, who we're going to be talking about in the 90s, and Donald Trump at the very end of the unit when we talk about, well, recent history, both of them would be impeached, but both were acquitted. But each time a president is impeached, it does have an impact on America and how we trust our system. Watergate's an important thing to study. Kids, I hope these and this is just a simplification. Hopefully you understand the simple concept. Watergate, a president was caught thinking he was above the law, and Watergate was where a president tries to cover up, impeach. Nixon's big crime again was covering up. And because of that, justice eventually hit. Covering a crime is as bad as the crime in the eyes of the law. You're an accessory. And Watergate, we have a president that is going to be wrapped up. Now, whether you talk about Nixon, and a lot of people, look at the Nixon White House and presidency just as Watergate, forget that Nixon did do other stuff. Nixon, again, did open up relations with Russia, with China. And there's other stuff Nixon did too. But you know what? In the end, Richard Nixon will always be remembered for Watergate and the president that resigned.